Hello and welcome to BQ Prime. You're joining us on this special broadcast where we're discussing Moody's rating for India. To discuss this further, we have with us Christian de Guzman from Moody's. Welcome, Christian, to this conversation. Now, your report on India's rating came out on the 18th of August, where you have affirmed the Baa3 rating as well as retained the stable outlook that you had on the sovereign rating. I'm curious to understand. In terms of your assessment of the current situation, there have been significant improvements on the fiscal position of India, but then the rating continues to remain the same. I just wanted to get through some of the reasons why the rationale behind this decision.
Okay, thanks for having me. I think we do want to acknowledge that our rating isn't just looking at the economy. Right. I think, as you rightly said, we also take a view on the fiscals, but we also take a view on perhaps some of the areas that we will be talking about, such as the government's policy effectiveness, as well as things like political risk and external vulnerability. But I guess to the general point, and I think of much interest to the public, is the point that the Indian economy is actually doing very well. And we have acknowledged that. I think part of the reason why we have affirmed the Baa3 rating is the view that India has emerged from the pandemic in a stronger position than when it had entered into the pandemic. So that's the first point. But amidst that sort of context, that background, we have, as you had mentioned, seen a degree of fiscal consolidation from pandemic-era settings. But when you look at the government's balance sheet, and when you look at the fiscal deficit, it still remains wide compared to historical levels. It remains wide compared to other peers rated around the Baa3 or the Baa space, so other emerging markets like the Philippines or Indonesia or Colombia. So I think the way we would want to sort of look at this from a big picture perspective is that the strengths, the gains in the economy, given the outperformance of the Indian economy in this sort of very sort of cloudy, very uncertain global economic outlook, have been outweighed by still limited gains in terms of improvements on the fiscal side.
Okay. Coming to, I'll break this conversation up into a few of the points that you mentioned, talking about the fiscal consolidation bit now. We are a few months away from a national election in the country. I wanted to get a sense as to how you read the government's fiscal path that they've laid out for India, and whether there are risks that still continue, considering that we're still a developing economy, an emerging economy, as most international analysts would put it. Do you think that there are risks still for the consolidation path ahead for India?
I guess firstly, we want to give credit where it is due. Over the past year, as India has emerged from the pandemic, I think it is natural to see a degree of fiscal consolidation as economies emerging from the pandemic no longer need pandemic era assistance, and certainly India is one of those. So that's that. But then, of course, we've had the inflation shock, and that did lead to a decision by policymakers to provide targeted assistance to the people, to businesses, to help cope with these sort of higher price pressures. And that did put some pressure on overall spending. But then that was also matched over the past year by outperformance on revenue. And I think we also do acknowledge the gains there, especially since we do think that they are sustainable given what's driving them. Not just a stronger economy, but changes to tax administration through digitalization, for example. So amidst all, that sort of backdrop, that story, we did see the fiscal consolidation trend continue. So for now, going on 3 consecutive years, continuous gradual fiscal consolidation towards the government's stated fiscal deficit target of 4.5% of GDP. Now, from where we are sitting, we have also said that there has not been a very clear articulation in terms of how do you then get from 6+% to 4.5% of GDP in a span of 2.5, 3 years, right? The target is for 25, 26.
Yeah.
And basically, how do you get there? Typically, it's either you raise revenue or you cut spending. Ideally, a combination of both. You're mentioning the context being the elections. In any democracy, I think it is very hard to actually pass meaningful revenue reform that increases the revenue take, because that either increases that means either increasing tax rates or broadening the tax base. None of these will gain you votes, right? So India is not alone here. So what we're saying here is that there's probably limited prospects for meaningful revenue reform that increases revenue to GDP. However, we do think the digitalization, the continued growth of the economy means that revenue is going to be supported. It's not going to be vastly stronger, but it is going to be supported and going to continue to be healthy. So where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us on the spending side. Much has been said about the increase in infrastructure spending, but I think what's also being sort of lost, sort of in that sort of the headline enthusiasm around infrastructure spending, is that the overall spending envelope as a share of GDP has actually come down. So that's part of the fiscal consolidation story. So, but yet, when you look at the fiscal deficits, it's still only gradually consolidating. So which does put that deficit target, meeting that deficit target by 25-26 a bit of a challenge. Not to say that that they're not going to get there, but it will be challenging.
Okay. You mentioned infrastructure spending. People are now talking about, at least domestically, they're talking about the picking up, sort of a pickup in the private capital expenditure as far as infrastructure as well as manufacturing is concerned. I'm curious to understand, do you think that the space left out by the government in trying to curb that kind of spending, will that be picked up by the private sector adequately?
Right. Well, I think you're asking like two different questions here. One is infrastructure, one is manufacturing, and perhaps those are fine, because I think the plan is, as we have seen in other countries as well, is you improve your infrastructure so that you crowd in investment, which then makes your country more attractive for manufacturing investment. Right. And I think that has been the goal of this Moody administration, for a long time now, with the Make in India, with the PLI scheme. You are trying to attract that kind of activity onshore to generate jobs and to basically upskill the economy towards a sort of higher value added, more higher income, towards the 2007 goal of being a high income economy. So you need that. So there is evidence here that the private sector is indeed coming to the fore in terms of helping the government out with regards to participating in infrastructure. So the government isn't going to be alone here. I mean, the government is not a construction company, so it's going to need help anyway. So yes, there is interest from the private sector, as well as foreign sort of institutions like the multilateral development banks, which have come in to help finance infrastructure projects, especially those that are related towards the broader sort of environmental goals, such as the net zero target. So we do think that the space is there, and it really is about the execution.
Right. One of the points that you mentioned in the report is the increase in interest rates domestically as well as internationally. Now in India, we've seen about 250 basis point increase since May last year on the benchmark repo. I'm curious to understand in terms of your points about weaker affordability and higher debt burden, how that seems to be playing out, because this is a global phenomenon. So it's not like India is the only one that's sort of facing these issues.
Yes, that's correct. India is not the only one. I think the basic premise here is that we are not going to return to the sort of pandemic era or pre-pandemic era, for much of the 2000s following the...
I'm sorry, I think, Christian, we couldn't catch you. I think we've lost Christian for a second, but we'll just come back. But some of the points that seems to have been mentioned in the Moody's report, I think we have Christian back again. Christian, sorry for that brief interruption. But if you could just tell us a little bit about the points that we're making about affordability as well as debt burden.
Right. Yes. I guess my point that I was trying to make was, yes, India is not alone here, and simply because we are looking at a situation where, globally speaking, interest rates are now going to be much higher for longer, and we're not going to return to the sort of post-global financial crisis era in terms of vast global monetary easing, leading to very, very low and in many cases negative interest rates. Which is then impacting places like India, which has had structurally higher interest rate environment. That had actually helped push interest rates down in India. Over the past few years, but we're not going to be in that situation anymore. So, to the extent that the pandemic did lead to higher debt, and once again, we're not singling out India here. This applies to pretty much every country out there that was impacted by the pandemic, which is basically everyone. Everybody has balance sheets that are worse off. But to varying degrees. And in the case of India, that's in the order of 15 to 20 percentage points of GDP in terms of general government debt. So, given that higher level of debt, they are now going to have to pay higher interest rates on that debt as they come due.
Right.
I think, as we all know, government debt is typically not paid off; it's refinanced. So, all those debts that were incurred during the low interest rate environment over the past few years, during the pandemic and before the pandemic, is going to be refinanced at higher interest rates. And then we have continued relatively wide fiscal deficits, which also need to be financed by debt at those higher interest rates. So our point here is that it is going to be challenging for the Indian government to improve debt affordability. And that is our measure that we use for our fiscal strength assessment. Simply put, interest payments to revenue. I already mentioned the challenges related to revenue, but the interest payment debt servicing picture is also key to that story.
You also mentioned the potential growth sort of having come down over the last 7 to 10 years. Now, this is not got anything to do with the pandemic. The pandemic, of course, sort of accelerated that slowing down of growth. But if you could just articulate that a little better, what's actually happened here? Because when people look at these numbers, they tend to look at the headline figure and say, "Oh, India is still the fastest growing economy in the world." So, not entirely sure, that disconnect exists in certain people's minds. So, if you can just tell us a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I think you're asking the right question, but because it is a bit of a nuanced story. If you, many of your viewers would recall that we had actually upgraded India's rating to Baa2 in 2017. Yeah. Now, I'm pointing this out because the view at the time with regards to India was a forward-looking view based on our assessment of the forward-looking effectiveness of the Moody government's reforms at the outset of the first couple of years. So as a result of those reforms, we had the view that growth will pick up quite meaningfully at around 7 to 8%. So that our potential growth view for India on a forward-looking basis, on a sustainable forward-looking basis, was 7 to 8%. And then combined with the view that that they were committed to fiscal consolidation on the back of the FRBM recommendations, that we would see a decided downward trajectory in debt. However, what had happened was we had soon after we upgraded to Baa2 on the basis of that very strong growth and very rapid fiscal consolidation, we had a situation where there was financial sector instability. Right. And you saw how that financial sector instability actually weighed on growth because the financial sector could not provide credit in a sufficient way to support growth. And so even prior to the pandemic, unlike other countries, India was already in a fairly weak economic position because of those financial sector fragilities. And we did end up downgrading in 2020 on the back of a view of lower potential growth based on both the combination of those financial sector instabilities, the weakened state of the financial sector, plus our view of potential economic scarring from the pandemic. Okay, and that, of course, is then going to translate to an even weaker fiscal position for India, rather than an that was commensurate with our upgrade to Baa2. So that Baa3 rating, when we downgraded, we were thinking that potential growth was actually had dipped to under 6% based on the considerations that I mentioned. But in our current view, with regards to our affirmation of the current Baa3 rating with a stable outlook, we were saying that compared to that situation where potential growth was under 6% entering into the pandemic or in the first years of the pandemic, India's potential growth has actually improved to over 6%. So we're thinking 6 to 6.5% because of underlying improvements in the way that the economy is run. We think that there are actual productivity gains from the traction on the government's infrastructure program. We think there are tangible productivity gains from digitalization. We think there are also progress, not mission accomplished by any means, but there also has been some progress with regards to promoting manufacturing investment. So this underlines our view of better potential growth. Yes, it's not as rosy as what we had thought in 2017.
Yeah.
But it's rosier than what we had thought in 2020.
Okay. My last question to you, Christian, is one of the points that you mentioned as part of your assessment of the fiscal strength of India as well as the overall rating, is the question of political risk. Now, you've mentioned in your report that there's been a curtailment of civil liberties as well as some amount of political dissent in the country, which raises the political risk as far as India is concerned. I'm curious to understand how much of an impact this has on India's fiscal position, or at all.
Sure. There, I guess one way to look at political risk, or actually methodologically speaking, our assessment of political risk falls under what we call susceptibility to event risk. So we're looking at tail risks and how they would impact either the way the country grows or the way it impacts the fiscal situation. I mean, currently speaking, political risk, we can also look at domestic political risk and geopolitical risk. And so I think this is important because we also compare India to other countries. Now, regarding domestic political risk, these things that you mentioned, the curtailment of civil liberties and political dissent, this is leading to or coinciding with a more polarized domestic political situation. You're seeing that with regards to how state governments are campaigning on freebies, right? So opposition governments that are coming into power in certain states are reversing their position with regards to pension systems, reverting to old defined benefit systems, which are fiscally negative as compared to defined contribution systems, for example. So I think that's a clear articulation of how political risk can turn into sort of some negative pressures on the fiscal side. We've had an example over the past, in a relatively recent past, of very well-meaning agricultural reform being reversed, by street protests. So yet another manifestation of political risk, domestic political risk, that we do not see in peers that we previously assessed with the same domestic political risk score as India. And these include places like Switzerland or Ireland or Andorra or Costa Rica. I mean, I think it's quite clear. The domestic political risk situation in those countries is more stable than what we do see in India. But I want to be clear here. When I mean stable, I do not mean that there is a meaningful risk of leadership change or regime instability. We do currently, during our observation of the political scene, we do expect the Moody government to retain its seat and power at next year's election. So this is not what we're talking about.
Right.
We're talking about just the risk to policy. And then I mentioned geopolitical risk. In none of the countries that I had mentioned do we actually have actual tensions with neighboring countries. I mean, the tensions that we have with Pakistan and China often escalate into actual physical conflict. Nowhere is this actually present in countries that had that we had assigned the same sort of political risk score as India previously. So that is one other aspect I think that we do need to sort of bring out, that a lot of our analysis is often comparative.
All right. Thank you so much, Christian, for joining us on this conversation. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.